The rain hammered against the windows of the safe house in Portsmouth as Captain James Mitchell studied the photographs spread across the wooden table. It was May 28th, 1944, and the weight of what was coming pressed down on everyone in the room like a physical force. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, was just days away, and Mitchell had a problem that could cost thousands of lives. The photographs showed German fortifications along the Normandy coast. Concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, artillery positions. But they were incomplete. British intelligence had aerial reconnaissance, resistance reports, and captured documents. But there was a critical gap. The Germans had been moving units around the Pas-de-Calais and Normandy areas for weeks, and no one knew exactly where the 352nd Infantry Division had been repositioned. If that division was sitting on Omaha Beach when the Americans landed, the casualty rate would be catastrophic. Mitchell was 32 years old, a former professor of European history from Boston who had been recruited into the Office of Strategic Services in 1942. He spoke fluent German, having spent 2 years in Berlin before the war, and he understood how the Wehrmacht thought. That's why he'd been given this assignment. He needed to get someone behind enemy lines, into Normandy itself, to confirm the German positions before D-Day. And he needed to do it in less than a week. The man sitting across from him was smoking a cigarette with the calm of someone who had already made peace with death. Sergeant Thomas Reid was British, a commando from a special operations executive who had parachuted into France 4 times already. He was lean, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to calculate angles and distances even when he was sitting still. Next to him sat Lieutenant Marie Duclos, a French resistance fighter who had escaped to England 6 months earlier. She knew every road, every village, every German checkpoint in the Calvados region. The problem, Mitchell said, pointing to the map, is that we need someone who can move freely, someone the Germans won't question. We can't just drop a commando team in there and hope they stay hidden for 5 days while they scout the entire coastline. Reid crushed out his cigarette. You're talking about going in as a German. Mitchell nodded. We've done it before. Operation Gunnerside in Norway. The saboteurs posed as locals, but we've had agents go in wearing Wehrmacht uniforms. That's a death sentence if you're caught, Marie said quietly. Her English carried a heavy accent, but her words were precise. The Germans execute spies immediately. No trial. No prisoner exchange. I know the risks, Mitchell replied. But if we don't know where the 352nd Division is, we're sending men into a meat grinder. The landing zones were chosen based on intelligence that's now 3 weeks old. 3 weeks. The Germans could have moved an entire corps into position by now. Reid leaned back in his chair. What's the cover story? Mitchell pulled out a folder and opened it. Inside were documents, all in German. An identity card, travel orders, requisition forms. You'll be Oberleutnant Karl Hoffmann, a logistics officer from the 84th Corps headquarters in St. Lo. You're conducting a supply audit of coastal defenses in preparation for a visit from Field Marshal Rommel's staff. It gives you a reason to ask questions, inspect positions, and move between different units. Where did you get the papers? Marie asked, picking up the identity card. The photograph showed a man who looked remarkably like Reid. Same sharp features, same cold eyes. The real Karl Hoffmann was captured in Tunisia last year, Mitchell said. He's in a POW camp in Scotland. We've kept his identity active in German records. As far as the Wehrmacht knows, he's still serving in France. Reid studied the documents carefully. The details were impeccable. Even the paper was authentic, taken from captured German supplies. You've got someone on the inside feeding you information. Mitchell didn't confirm or deny it. The truth was that British intelligence had turned a clerk in the German administrative offices in Rouen, but that information was compartmentalized. The fewer people who knew, the better. You'll have support. Marie will go in first, 2 days ahead of you. She'll be your contact on the ground. If something goes wrong, she can get you to a safe house. Marie was already shaking her head. I should be the one going in as the German officer. I know the area better. I speak German without an accent. The Wehrmacht doesn't have female logistics officers, Mitchell said gently. You'd be questioned immediately. But we need you there because you know which resistance cells are reliable and which ones have been compromised. If Reid needs to disappear, you're his only way out. Reid looked at the map again, tracing the coastline with his finger. What's my route? Mitchell pointed to several marks on the map. You'll be inserted by boat here, near Arromanches, on the night of June 1st. A fishing vessel operated by the resistance will take you within swimming distance of the shore. You'll come ashore in civilian clothes, hide them, and change into the uniform. From there, you'll make your way to Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer and begin your inspections. You'll have 3 days to gather intelligence on German positions from Vierville to Callaville. On June 4th, you'll transmit your findings using a portable radio, then make your way to an extraction point near Port-en-Bessin. And if I can't make the extraction, then you go to ground and wait for the invasion. Once our forces secure the beach, you link up with the first wave and identify yourself. Reid smiled grimly. Assuming I'm not shot by our own side for wearing a German uniform. That's why you'll carry identification sewn into your uniform lining, Mitchell said. If you're captured by Allied forces, you show them that. If you're captured by Germans, you destroy it. The plan was insane, and everyone in the room knew it, but it was also necessary. The success of the invasion depended on knowing exactly what they were facing. If the intelligence was wrong, if the Germans had reinforced Normandy beyond what the planners expected, the entire operation could fail. And if Operation Overlord failed, the war in Europe could drag on for years. Reid spent the next 2 days memorizing everything about Karl Hoffmann's life, where he was born, where he went to school, his military service record, the names of his commanding officers. Every detail had to be perfect because German officers were meticulous, and any inconsistency could raise suspicions. He practiced his signature until it matched the samples in the file. He learned the proper way to salute, the correct forms of address for different ranks, the bureaucratic procedures for requisitioning supplies. Marie left for France on the night of May 30th, dropped by parachute into a field near Bayeux. She carried nothing that could identify her as working for British intelligence. Her cover was simple. She was a courier for the resistance, carrying messages between cells. If she was stopped, she would claim ignorance of the contents. The Germans would probably torture her anyway, but the cover story might buy her enough time. Reid went in on the night of June 1st. The fishing boat smelled of diesel and rotting fish, and the crossing was rough. The English Channel in early June was cold and unforgiving, with swells that made even experienced sailors sick. Reid spent the journey in the cabin below deck, reviewing his notes one last time. The resistance operative who captained the boat said nothing, just smoked his pipe and kept the vessel on course. They reached the drop point at 2 a.m. Reid could see the dark mass of the French coastline ahead, a black line against the slightly lighter sky. There were no lights. The Germans had enforced a total blackout along the coast, and the only illumination came from occasional searchlights sweeping the water. "This is as close as I can get," the captain said in French. "You swim from here. Follow the coast west for about half a kilometer. There's a small cove with rocks. That's your landing point." Reid stripped down to his underclothes and sealed his civilian clothes and the German uniform in a waterproof bag. The water was shockingly cold when he slid over the side. He kept the bag strapped to his chest and began swimming, using a slow, steady stroke that wouldn't attract attention. The current pulled at him, trying to drag him east, but he compensated, angling his approach. It took him 20 minutes to reach the shore. He crawled up onto the rocks, shivering, his muscles cramping from the cold. For a few moments, he just lay there listening. There were no sounds except the waves and the distant call of seabirds. No patrols. No dogs. Nothing. He found cover behind a concrete pillbox that had been built into the rocks and changed into dry clothes. The civilian outfit was simple. Work pants, a ruffle shirt, cap. The kind of clothes a laborer or fisherman would wear. He buried the waterproof bag under rocks, making careful note of the location in case he needed to retrieve it. The walk to St. Laurent-sur-Mer took 3 hours. He moved carefully, avoiding roads, using hedgerows and farm tracks. Twice he had to hide when he heard vehicles approaching. Both times there were German trucks, probably supply convoys heading to coastal positions. The Wehrmacht was definitely active in the area, which was not a good sign. He reached the town just before dawn and found a small barn where he could hide until it was time to change into the uniform. The barn belonged to a farm that looked abandoned. The fields hadn't been tended in weeks, and there was no livestock. Either the family had fled, or the Germans had requisitioned everything. As the sun came up, Reid changed into the Wehrmacht uniform. It fit perfectly, tailored to match the measurements they had taken in England. The field gray tunic, the black boots, the officer's cap with its eagle insignia. He strapped on the pistol belt, checked that the Walther P-38 was loaded, and studied himself in a piece of broken mirror. He looked like a German officer. He looked like the enemy. The first test came within an hour. He was walking along the main road toward the coast when a German patrol stopped him. 2 soldiers, barely out of their teens, with rifles slung over their shoulders. They snapped to attention when they saw his rank. "Oberleutnant," one of them said, saluting. "Papers, please." Reid returned the salute with the proper casual arrogance of an officer annoyed at being delayed. "Are you in the habit of stopping officers on official business, soldat?" The soldier's face went pale. "No, Herr Oberleutnant. We're under orders to check everyone. There have been reports of resistance activity." Reid pulled out his papers and handed them over. His heart was pounding, but his hand was steady. The soldier examined the documents carefully, comparing the photograph to Reid's face. For a long moment, there was silence. Then the soldier handed them back and saluted again. "Everything is in order, Herr Oberleutnant. Forgive the delay." Reid nodded curtly and continued walking. He didn't look back. Behind him, he could hear the soldiers discussing whether they had been too aggressive in stopping an officer. Good. Let them worry. Worried soldiers didn't ask follow-up questions. The coastal defenses were more extensive than the aerial photographs had shown. Reid spent the morning walking the beach, ostensibly checking supply depots and ammunition stores. In reality, he was counting gun positions, noting fields of fire, memorizing the placement of obstacles. The Germans had installed thousands of wooden stakes on the beach, angled toward the sea, designed to tear the bottoms out of landing craft. Behind them were rows of Czech hedgehogs, metal anti-tank obstacles that would stop vehicles. And behind those were the bunkers, concrete fortifications with interlocking fields of fire. But what concerned Reid most was the infantry. There were far more soldiers here than there should have been. He recognized the insignia. The 352nd Infantry Division, the division that intelligence said might have moved to this area. They were here, dug in, waiting, and they had excellent positions. The bluffs overlooking the beach provided perfect cover, and the narrow draws that led up from the sand were choked with barbed wire and mines. He needed to get this information back to England immediately, but he also needed more details. Which specific units were where? What was their strength? What kind of artillery support did they have? He spent the afternoon visiting different positions, using his cover as a logistics officer to ask questions. How many shells did they have stockpiled? Were their supply lines adequate? Had they received the anti-tank guns they had requisitioned? The soldiers answered readily. Why wouldn't they? He was an officer from Corps headquarters, conducting an official audit. They showed him ammunition bunkers, fuel depots, communication trenches. They complained about shortages and the quality of their rations. They told him that Rommel himself had visited 2 weeks ago and praised their preparations. By evening, Reid had gathered enough information to fill several pages of notes, but he couldn't write anything down. Not while he was still in uniform, still moving among German units. He would have to commit everything to memory and write the report when he was alone. He found accommodations for the night in a commandeered farmhouse that was being used as a junior officer's billet. There were 6 other officers there, mostly lieutenants and captains. They were suspicious at first, asking questions about his assignment, but Reid deflected smoothly. He had learned that the best way to avoid scrutiny was to be boring. He talked about requisition forms and supply manifests until the other officers lost interest and went back to their card game. After midnight, when everyone was asleep, Reid slipped out of the farmhouse. He had spotted a German signal station earlier, a small building with a radio antenna. If he could get inside, he might be able to send a message directly to England. But as he approached, he realized it was too heavily guarded. 3 soldiers on duty, rotating shifts, with clear sight lines in all directions. There was no way to get in without being seen. He would have to wait until his scheduled transmission time on June 4th. That meant another 2 days of gathering intelligence while maintaining his cover. The next morning, June 3rd, Reid continued his inspections, moving east toward Colleville. The pattern was the same everywhere he looked. Strong defensive positions, well-supplied units, and high morale. The Germans were ready for an invasion. They had been expecting it for months, and they had used that time well. At one position, he encountered a major from the 352nd, who was more curious than the others. "Hoffman, is it?" the major said, studying Reid's papers. "I don't recall hearing about a logistics audit." "It was ordered by Field Marshal Rommel's staff," Reid said smoothly. "They want to ensure all coastal defenses are fully supplied before the inspection next week." "An inspection next week?" The major frowned. "This is the first I'm hearing of it." Reid shrugged. "You know how staff officers are. They don't tell anyone anything until the last minute. I'm just following orders." The major seemed satisfied with that explanation, but Reid knew he was on borrowed time. Someone would eventually check his story with higher headquarters, and when they did, the whole thing would unravel. He needed to finish his reconnaissance and get out. That evening, he met Marie in a small church in Colleville. She was posing as a local woman doing cleaning work, and they had arranged the meeting to look like a chance encounter. Reid knelt in one of the pews, pretending to pray, while Marie swept the floor nearby. "The resistance says the Germans are moving more units in," she whispered. "There's talk of a panzer division being held in reserve near Caen." "I've seen enough," Reid said quietly. "The 352nd is here in force, at least 8 battalions spread along the beach. They've got artillery support from the 716th Static Division. The defenses are concentrated at the draws. If the landing goes ahead as planned, Omaha Beach is going to be hell." "Can you get the information out?" "I transmit tomorrow night, but I need to be somewhere quiet, away from German positions. Too much risk of radio detection." Marie nodded. "There's a farmhouse about 3 kilometers inland, near Formigny. The family is with us. You can transmit from there." "And the extraction?" "Still on for Port-en-Bessin, June 4th at 11 p.m. A boat will be waiting offshore. Flash 3 long, 2 short with a torch. They'll send a dinghy." Reid glanced around to make sure they were still alone. "If I don't make it, make sure this information gets to Allied Command. The landing plan needs to be adjusted. They need more troops in the first wave, more naval bombardment, more everything." "You'll make it," Marie said, but her eyes said she didn't believe it. Reid left the church and began walking toward Formigny. He needed to get out of the German uniform, at least temporarily. Being caught in it at night, away from any military installation, would be impossible to explain. He found a grove of trees and changed into the civilian clothes he had carried in a pack. The uniform went into the pack, carefully folded. He would need it one more time to get through checkpoints on his way to the extraction point. The farmhouse was exactly where Marie said it would be. An old stone building with a thatched roof, surrounded by overgrown fields. He approached carefully, watching for any signs of German presence. When he was certain it was clear, he knocked on the door using the signal Marie had taught him. 3 quick raps, pause, 2 slow raps. An elderly man opened the door. He looked at Reid without surprise, just stepped aside and gestured for him to enter. Inside, the house was dark except for a single candle. A woman, presumably the man's wife, sat at the table peeling potatoes. Neither of them spoke. Reid set up the radio in an upstairs room, stringing the antenna out through the window. The device was a British B-2 set, Small enough to fit in a suitcase, but powerful enough to reach England if conditions were right. He checked his watch. It was 9 p.m. He had 2 hours until the scheduled transmission window. He spent the time writing his report in code, working from memory. Every gun position, every unit identification, every detail he had observed. The report ran to 3 pages of densely packed text. When he was finished, he encrypted it using the one-time pad he had memorized before leaving England. The encryption was unbreakable, but it was also slow. Each letter had to be converted individually. At 11 p.m., he powered up the radio and began transmitting. The signal went out in bursts of Morse code, rapid-fire groups of letters that meant nothing to anyone who didn't have the decryption key. He transmitted for 12 minutes, repeating the message twice to ensure it got through. When he was finished, he shut down the radio and waited. If the signal had been detected by German radio-finding units, they would be coming. He sat in the dark, the Walther P-38 in his hand, listening to the sounds of the night. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Nothing. He dismantled the radio and packed it away, then went downstairs. The old man was still sitting at the table, smoking a pipe. He looked at Reid and nodded once. Message received. Get out. Reid changed back into the German uniform and left the farmhouse. He had 12 hours to reach Port-en-Bessin. The walk would take 6 hours, maybe 7 if he had to avoid patrols. That left time for delays, but not much. The night was cloudy, which was good for concealment, but bad for navigation. Reid moved carefully, using the stars when he could see them, relying on his compass when he couldn't. The roads were dangerous, but cross-country travel was worse. The fields were laced with drainage ditches and hedgerows, and in the dark, it was easy to get turned around. He made good progress for the first hour, then ran into a problem. There was a German checkpoint ahead, blocking the only bridge across a small river. He could see lanterns and the silhouettes of soldiers. There was no way around. He would have to bluff his way through. Reid straightened his uniform, adjusted his cap, and walked toward the checkpoint with the confidence of an officer who expected to be obeyed. The soldiers saw him coming and snapped to attention. "Oberleutnant," one of them said, "the bridge is closed for the night. Orders from division headquarters." "I am aware of the order," Reid said coldly. "I am also under orders to return to St. Lo immediately. Are you telling me that your checkpoint orders supersede direct instructions from the 84th Corps?" The soldier hesitated. "No, Oberleutnant, but we're supposed to verify all travel orders." Reid handed over his papers with an expression of barely contained annoyance. "Verify them quickly. I don't have time for this." The soldier examined the papers, then looked up at Reid. "These orders are dated May 15th. That's almost 3 weeks ago." "Yes," Reid said, "because I've been conducting inspections for 3 weeks. Is there a problem with that?" "No, Oberleutnant. It's just unusual." "Many things in war are unusual, Soldat. Now, am I going to cross this bridge, or am I going to report to your commanding officer that his checkpoint is preventing critical logistics work?" The soldier looked at his companion, who shrugged. Then he handed back the papers and saluted. "You may cross, Oberleutnant." Reid walked across the bridge without looking back. His heart was hammering, but his pace was steady. On the other side, he allowed himself a moment to breathe, then continued walking. He reached the outskirts of Port-en-Bessin at 10:30 p.m. The town was under curfew, and German patrols were active. He needed to find a way down to the beach without being seen. He circled around the town, moving through gardens and back alleys, until he found a narrow path that led down the cliffs to the water. The beach was dark and empty. Reid checked his watch. 10:55 p.m. He found a position behind some rocks and pulled out the torch. At exactly 11 p.m., he began flashing the signal. 3 long, 2 short. He repeated it 3 times, then waited. Nothing. The sea was empty, just waves rolling in against the shore. Reid waited 5 minutes, then flashed the signal again. Still nothing. At 11:20 p.m., he began to accept that the extraction wasn't coming. Something had gone wrong. Maybe the boat had been intercepted. Maybe the weather had turned bad farther out. It didn't matter. He was on his own. He moved away from the beach and found shelter in a bombed-out building on the edge of town. He would have to wait for the invasion now. According to the schedule he had been given, it was supposed to happen on June 5th, but weather could delay it. He might have to hide for days. He spent the daylight hours of June 4th sleeping in shifts, always keeping one ear open for sounds of German patrols. When night fell again, he moved to a different location, an abandoned barn closer to the beach. From there, he could watch the sea. June 5th came and went. No invasion. Reid began to worry that it had been called off entirely, that something had gone wrong with the whole operation. But on the evening of June 5th, he noticed increased German activity. Trucks moving toward the coast, officers shouting orders, soldiers taking up defensive positions. They knew something was coming. In the early hours of June 6th, Reid heard the sound of aircraft. Hundreds of them, a deep thrumming that filled the sky. He crept out of the barn and looked up. The clouds were breaking apart, and he could see the dark shapes passing overhead, wave after wave of transport planes and bombers. Then came the naval bombardment. The sound was like the end of the world, a continuous rolling thunder as Allied warships offshore opened fire on German positions. The ground shook with each impact. Explosions lit up the pre-dawn darkness, and Reid could hear the screams of wounded men. He made his way carefully toward the beach, staying in cover. The German defenses were fully alert now, every gun firing out to sea. Through the smoke and chaos, Reid could see the landing craft approaching. Hundreds of them, packed with soldiers. The slaughter on Omaha Beach was worse than anything Reid had imagined. The landing craft hit obstacles and mines, exploding in geysers of water and debris. Soldiers who made it to the beach were cut down by machine gun fire from the bunkers. The bodies piled up at the waterline, and still more boats kept coming. Reid found a position on the bluffs where he could watch without being in the direct line of fire. He was still wearing the German uniform, which meant both sides would shoot him on sight. He needed to find American soldiers who had made it past the beach and identify himself before someone put a bullet in him. It took until mid-morning before Allied forces began to push inland. A group of Rangers had scaled the cliffs to the west and were working their way through German positions. Reid watched them advance, then made his decision. He tore open the lining of his uniform and pulled out the identification papers that proved he was Allied intelligence. Then he stepped out into the open, hands raised, shouting in English, "Don't shoot. I'm American. OSS." The Rangers spun toward him, rifles raised. For a long moment, no one moved. Then a sergeant approached cautiously, keeping his weapon trained on Reid. "You're wearing a German uniform." "I know," Reid said. "I'm Captain James Mitchell's operative. I was behind enemy lines gathering intelligence. My identification is in my left hand." The sergeant took the papers and examined them, then looked at Reid with new respect. "You're the guy who sent the report about the 352nd Division." "That's me." "Well, you were right. They were here, and they've been killing us all morning." Reid looked out at the beach, at the bodies and burning vehicles, at the soldiers still fighting to push inland. The intelligence he had gathered had been accurate, but it hadn't been enough to prevent the carnage. The planners had known what they were facing, but they had gone ahead anyway because there was no choice. The invasion had to happen, no matter the cost. "Did my report make it to Eisenhower?" Reid asked. The sergeant nodded. "Yeah, they adjusted the naval bombardment schedule and added extra battalions to the first wave. Could have been worse if they hadn't known." Could have been worse. Reid looked at the beach again and wondered how that was possible. But he also knew it was true. If the landing had gone in completely blind, if they hadn't known about the 352nd Division, if they hadn't prepared for the worst, the entire operation might have failed. His mission had mattered. It had saved lives, even if it hadn't saved enough. He spent the rest of D-Day helping coordinate movements for the advancing American forces, using his knowledge of German positions to identify weaknesses in their defenses. By nightfall, the Allies had secured a foothold on Omaha Beach. It was narrow and it was bloody, but it was enough. 3 days later, Reid was evacuated to England along with a group of wounded soldiers. Captain Mitchell met him at the field hospital, looking older and more tired than Reid remembered. "Good work," Mitchell said quietly. "Your report was accurate. The 352nd was exactly where you said they were." "It wasn't enough," Reid said. "It never is. But it was something. And in this war, that has to be enough." Reid thought about that for a long time afterward, about the men who had died on the beach, about the intelligence that could have saved them if it had been more complete, more timely, more something, about the impossible choices that war demanded. He never wore a German uniform again, but he continued working for the OSS, running other operations, gathering other intelligence, because Mitchell was right. In war, something was better than nothing. And sometimes the difference between something and nothing was measured in lives saved, even if it was never enough. The ghost of Normandy, they called him later, when the story was declassified. The American who had walked among the Germans in the days before D-Day and brought back the information that helped win the war. But Reid never thought of himself that way. He was just a soldier who had done his job in the only way he knew how. And if that job meant wearing the enemy's uniform and pretending to be someone he wasn't, then that was what he had done. Because in the end, that's what spies do. They become ghosts moving through enemy territory, invisible and unknown, gathering the secrets that can change the course of history. And sometimes, if they're lucky and skilled and very careful, they survive to tell the story.